On a moonless night in the late 1940s, the Bavarian forest did something it almost never does. It fell completely silent. No owls, no distant cowbells from mountain farms. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath between the dark silhouettes of fir trees. Then, slowly, you could hear it. Boots on soft earth, labored breathing, the clink of a metal buckle someone was trying desperately to keep quiet. A small group moved along a narrow hunter's trail that twisted through the pines above the border between Bavaria and a world that called itself People's Democracy. They carried almost nothing: a small satchel, a wrapped bundle, a child in his mother's arms. At the front of the line, a man in a wool cap and worn mountain jacket touched the trunks as he passed them, counting silently in his head. He knew every bend of this trail, every root that jutted across the path, every rock that could twist an ankle. He had walked these hills as a boy, hunting rabbits and gathering firewood. Tonight, he was guiding human lives. He stopped abruptly, raising one gloved hand. Behind him, the line froze. Below them, perhaps 200 yards away, a beam of white light sliced through the darkness. A patrol. Back and forth, like a metronome, sweeping the forest edge at the line where the Soviet world ended and the Western world began. The man in the wool cap watched that beam, calculating. He knew the rhythm. He knew how long it took to cross that open strip. He knew where the ground sloped just enough that if you crawled, the patrol on the other side would never see you against the black edge of the forest. He also knew, though he would never say it out loud, that somewhere high above this quiet patch of earth, American eyes were watching too. Not eyes in a tower, eyes in the sky. Radios, antennas, listening posts, lines of information flowing from this frontier into rooms filled with maps, cables, and humming machines. He turned back to the little group, nodded once, and whispered. When the light swung away, they would move. If they could make it across that strip of ground, they would go from a world where the state owned their future to a world where their future was their own. To understand why a story like this should mean something to an American audience, you have to pull back from that trail, like a camera on a crane, and see the board the way Washington and Moscow saw it. After World War II, Germany was cut in half. The inner German border and the frontiers of Czechoslovakia and other Soviet bloc states were turned into something the world had never seen on this scale before: a militarized landscape of ditches, plowed strips, signal wires, fences, sometimes mines, and men with orders to shoot. On the eastern side, the logic was simple. The state claimed to be building a workers' paradise. If people did not want to live in paradise, they had to be stopped from leaving. So the border became a prison wall that ran for hundreds of miles across fields, rivers, and mountains. On the western side, in places like Bavaria, the border looked different. Yes, there were police and customs officers. Yes, there were patrols. But the assumption was not no one leaves. The assumption was we decide who comes in, and we do it through law, not barbed wire and bullets. The Soviets built an iron curtain of steel and fear. The United States and its allies built something less visible but ultimately more powerful. They built systems to handle what happened when people decided they were done with the Soviet experiment. They built refugee processing centers, legal frameworks, intelligence debriefing protocols, airlift programs, quotas, and data networks to move information and people. So, when you hear about a Bavarian mountain guide leading fugitives along secret trails, you should picture two layers in your mind. On the surface, a man who knows every ridge and ravine, using his knowledge of the land to slip past patrol lights. Underneath, cables, radios, and later satellites and computers that turned every successful escape into information and into a quiet victory for the West. The Soviet version of a border was designed for one purpose: seal, control, contain. Along the inner German border and the frontier with Czechoslovakia, they plowed wide sand or earth strips to reveal footprints. They installed tripwire alarms, observation towers with searchlights, and multiple layers of fencing. In some sectors, especially in the 1950s, they even used mines. On maps in military headquarters, it looked perfect. Zone A, Zone B, patrol schedules, kill zones. But the real world is not a map. The real world is hills and rivers and fog. It is the dense tangle of pine forest in the Bavarian borderlands where autumn mist turns sound into a dull blur and sightlines vanish after 100 feet. In that terrain, technology built only for control starts to show cracks. Spotlights can only scan so far. Tripwires can be bypassed by someone who knows exactly where they run. Patrols that march along the same route at the same hour every night become predictable. That is where local knowledge becomes a weapon. Imagine you are a peasant farmer or a woodcutter in those hills. You grew up knowing which trails bog down into swamp after a rain, which deer paths cut behind boulders, which ravines amplify sound, and which swallow it. You know where border guards like to smoke, where they stop for coffee, where their dog teams have trouble tracking a scent because of running water. Some of those people in the early Cold War years kept their heads down and went about their lives, but others, driven by politics, faith, or simply a hatred of the regime across the line, became something more. They became quiet allies of those trying to get out. There's a pattern in European history that shows up again and again. When a regime tries to seal its borders, the mountains answer. During and right after World War II, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust were led along hidden alpine routes from Austria into Italy by guides who knew every pass. They moved at night, without lanterns, in thin air, where a wrong step could mean death, even without a shot fired. Those guides were not always professionals. Sometimes they were former partisans, sometimes priests, sometimes villagers who have carried contraband instead of humans the year before. Their skill was simple and devastating from the perspective of a regime obsessed with control. They could look at a ridgeline and tell you where a group could cross without being seen. They could feel a shift in the wind and know that a dog patrol below would lose the scent. They knew, without checking a clock, when the patrol on the opposite slope changed shifts and the lights would go dark for a precious few seconds. After the war, when the Iron Curtain came down across Central Europe, that template did not disappear. The names and ideologies changed, but the physics of mountains did not. In the Alps and forested borderlands, the idea of a local guide leading fugitives around patrols was not a fantasy. It was an extension of an old, hard-earned craft. Now place that craft in Bavaria. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as communist regimes tightened their grip in Czechoslovakia and other eastern states, people who had worked with Western intelligence, with churches, or simply fallen out of favor faced arrest. Many headed for the border. The shortest line from danger to safety often cut through hills and forest. On the eastern side, security forces tried to adapt. They created border zones several kilometers deep, cleared lines of sight, and resettled people away from the fence. On the western side, in neighboring Bavaria, the landscape remained what it had always been: farms, villages, and deep woods. Somewhere in those woods, an arrangement would be made. A cousin knew someone in a village near the line. A priest knew a man who had smuggled livestock under the noses of customs officers for years. A former resistance fighter from the Nazi era, now deeply anti-communist, was willing to walk the hills one more time. No one wrote these agreements down. There are no glossy Soviet files with the label Bavarian Forest Guides. What we have instead are fragments. Stories of people who arrived at the border not by accident, but led. Accounts of fugitives who say, "We followed an older man through the woods. He knew exactly where to go. He told us when to stop breathing." From the Kremlin's perspective, this was infuriating. On paper, their control was total. In reality, people with nothing more than experience and courage were puncturing that control in the places it was supposed to be absolute. But here is where the story stops being just about mountain cunning and becomes something that speaks directly to American technological pride. Because every one of those quiet acts in the Bavarian forest had a shadow on the other side of the world. The United States did not just admire people who escaped, it prepared for them. It built a machine not to shoot people at borders, but to receive them. In Washington, Munich, and other hubs, American intelligence services worked with German partners to map the Iron Curtain down to individual observation towers. They use aerial photography, later satellites, and reports from merchants, hikers, and crucially, from escapees themselves. By the 1960s and 1970s, they could lay out on a light table or a computer screen the very strip of land our Bavarian guide was walking through. If a pattern emerged, patrols always on a certain ridgeline, a new cleared zone, a new watchtower, it went into the system. Not the Soviet system of paper files and paranoia, but a Western system of analysis and adaptation. That meant something astonishing in strategic terms. The United States could watch as the Soviet bloc invested steel, concrete, and manpower into border defenses, and then, without firing a shot, redirect its efforts to the places where those defenses were weakest. If a Bavarian guide found a blind spot in patrols or a gap in fencing where terrain made construction difficult, that knowledge did not just save one group. When it reached American or West German handlers, it became part of a living map. That map could then be used to plan future operations, to advise other would-be escapees, or to run couriers and agents across the line. The Soviets thought of the border as a static wall. The Americans increasingly treated it as a dynamic system that could be observed, modeled, and exploited. So when Soviet commanders read reports of persistent escapes in certain sectors, they were not just dealing with bad luck. They were up against a combination they didn't fully understand: local human expertise plus Western information technology. From an American point of view, this was the quiet front where the technological edge really hurt Moscow. In the popular imagination, Cold War tech stories are about iconic things: the U-2 spy plane, Corona satellites, big computers with blinking lights. But the most devastating use of technology was often invisible. It was the way the United States and its allies took messy human events at a border, a family caught at dawn, a patrol report, a smuggler's tale, and turned them into structured, shareable, actionable information. Refugees arriving in Bavaria or Austria were not just given blankets, they were interviewed. Their routes were sketched out, guards' routines were noted, fence types were described. This data went into reports, which went onto desks in intelligence centers and eventually into the brains of analysts comparing stories from dozens of crosses. When Soviet officers complained about holes in their border systems, those holes existed for two reasons. One, because the physical landscape favored people who knew it intimately, and two, because the West had built a feedback loop of technology and human intelligence that helped those people find and exploit those weak points. It's the kind of quiet superiority that rarely makes the front page, but it's exactly the kind of thing that makes a superpower truly formidable. Now, step back into the forest with that Bavarian guide. He waits, listening for the patrol below to turn back towards their checkpoint. He smells the damp earth, feels the nervous breath of the boy behind him on the back of his neck. He counts in his head. 3, 2, 1. They move. Down the slope, over the shallow ditch, across the strip of earth that, on the other side, has been plowed and raked so any footprint will stand out at dawn. They move in a low crouch, hands out, feeling for branches. They reach the line of trees on the western side. They do not cheer. They do not shout. They walk deeper into the woods until the guide is satisfied they are beyond any line of sight. Hours later, in a safe house, someone will telephone a contact in a West German town. An unmarked car will arrive. The family will be taken to a processing center where they will join the invisible queue that leads, perhaps, to a new life in Hamburg, in Canada, or in the United States. At some point along that chain, an American officer or analyst will read their story and add a small mark to a map, a new line for a patrol route, a tick for a watchtower, a note that in this sector on nights with low fog, dogs seem to lose the scent. The Bavarian guide may never know this. To him, the victory is simple: one more family out. To the Soviet colonel, reading his own morning report, it looks like something much more troubling: another failure of a system that was supposed to be airtight. What he cannot see is that he is not just losing people, he is losing information, legitimacy, and the psychological battle. For American viewers, this is where pride and fascination come together. Pride because the value system that made places like Bavaria a refuge and not a killing ground was backed by real capacity. It is one thing to say, "We welcome the oppressed." It is another to build all the gears that make that welcome possible: processing, resettlement, intelligence, law, logistics. The Soviet Union could point at its rockets and tanks, but when faced with a peasant family and a man who knew the forest, its arsenal of border technology suddenly looked clumsy, heavy, rigid. It could not bend, only break. The United States, on the other hand, invested in systems that could flex. If a route was exposed, analysts looked for another. If a particular stretch of border became too dangerous, they redirected people to a different sector. They updated their mental and literal maps constantly. This is the same mindset that produced American innovations in everything from logistics to computing. It is not just about building powerful machines. It is about integrating those machines into a network that amplifies human initiative instead of suffocating it. For the Soviets, the real shock was discovering that borders, the very lines they counted on to keep their people in, had become laboratories where this Western advantage played out in real time. They might have expected American pilots at 30,000 feet. They expected spies in embassies. What they did not expect was that the West would be so good at turning thousands of small acts of defiance on remote trails into a coherent picture of their own weaknesses. Every successful crossing guided by someone who knew the terrain in Bavaria was a statistical anomaly in a Soviet report. But in Langley, in Bonn, in Munich, those anomalies fed models, informed policy, and proved something crucial. Even with all their fences, the Soviets could not stop a determined individual backed indirectly by Western technology and organization. That realization eats at you if your system is built on control. It whispers that maybe your wall is not really a wall. Maybe it's just a line people haven't crossed yet. So the next time you see an old photo of a border tower, a strip of cleared land, and dark trees beyond, don't just see a relic, see a contest. On one side, a state that tried to hold back history with concrete and wire. On the other, a coalition led by the United States that used information, law, and human courage to turn every gap in that barrier into an opening. In the middle of that contest stands a figure the history books rarely name: a man from the Bavarian hills or a woman from a mountain village who knows the forest better than any general, who is willing to walk at night, in silence with strangers behind them, because they believe the line on the map should not be a life sentence. Those guides, those fugitives, and the systems that received them tell a story that Americans can rightly feel proud of, not just because the West won the Cold War, but because of how it won in places like that. By using technology not just to dominate, but to rescue. By turning forests the Soviets feared into corridors of escape. And by proving over and over that no matter how tall an empire builds its fences, there will always be people ready to climb them, and a free world armed with both courage and capability ready to catch them on the other side.